All right, so welcome to the introduction to congressional debates. First of all, I'm going to give you all an overview of what congressional debate actually is, how it functions, how a round works, and how to navigate all the procedural complexities of that. So first of all, let's talk about motions. How does the chamber get stuff done? So in Congress, uniquely for this speech and debate event, the entire chamber is self-governing. You do have judges, and they're going to sit in the back and usually say just about nothing, because when you and your other chambermates get into the round, you are responsible for running the round and for functioning as a simulation of the US government. So most action in a round and procedural motions happen through motions, which are basically just formal requests for action. Pretty much everything requires a motion. If you want to excuse yourself from the room, you have to raise your placard and make a motion to a point of personal privilege and excuse yourself. If you want to finish debate on a bill, you have to say, I move to the previous question. And that's going to get us to move to voting on the bill and then move on to the next subject of debate. And when you want to end the session, you have to move to adjourn. And after that, you are done with the round. So all of those things have to happen from a legislator, aka a student in the round, which is you. So one thing to note about motions is that pretty much all of them require a second. When I make a motion to move to the previous question, to move to voting, the PO is going to be like, okay, great, do we have a second? And someone else has to raise their placard and say, I second. And depending on the type of motion it is, it will also require a 1/2 or 2/3 majority, in which case the presiding officer will call a vote. After this event is done, I'm going to share the link to the slideshow so you can access the list of motions provided by the National Speech and Debate Association, which I have hyperlinked below. Now, you may have noticed I mentioned a PO. What is that? It's the presiding officer. They are the person responsible for running the session. And notably, they are actually a student elected from the legislators in the room. They have a very unique responsibility in terms of running the chamber and making sure everything goes smoothly. The PO oversees the round, recognizes the motions, processes the motions, as well as calling on speakers and giving them time signals during their speeches. The first thing you do in a round of Congress is choose and elect a presiding officer. So when you're all settled in your seats, your judges are there, everyone is there. The first thing you do is move to open the floor for PO nominations, in which case someone can raise their placard and say, hey, I nominate Senator Ostheimer. And then Senator Ostheimer, me, can accept. And if we have multiple nominations, then we're going to end up doing a secret ballot vote to determine who becomes the presiding officer. Something interesting to note is that the presiding officer is a competitor and will be ranked against all the other students competing in the room as speakers. This is interesting when it comes to bigger tournaments, where the presiding officer often is one of the highest performing people in the room, but not necessarily. And at the bottom, we have hyperlinked a spreadsheet, which is used to track recency. Part of a presiding officer's job is to make sure everyone gets a fair chance to speak, which means that they have to track who has spoken, how many times, how recently, and we have a handy PO sheet provided for you to use specifically for that purpose. By the way, if you ever have any questions, feel free to raise your Zoom hand and I'll just call on you and you can ask your question. Great. Moving on, let's talk about the docket. So choosing a docket is how your chamber of Congress chooses what legislation to debate and in what order. So at most tournaments, you're going to end up with a legislation packet which has all the topics you're going to debate. If it's just at a local tournament, you might get anywhere between 4 and 20 bills that you have to debate at that competition. While for bigger invitationals with elimination rounds, there might be separate legislation packets for each section of prelims, quarterfinals, semifinals, finals, whatever. However, you're not going to debate all of the bills you see on the docket. It is a very important process to understand how you choose which bills will be excluded from the debates. So that happens when, after you've elected your presiding officer, someone has to move to open the floor for docket nominations. That requires a second, and if there are no objections, the PO will move to open the floor for docket nominations. Then speakers can nominate a docket to indicate the order in which they want the legislation to be debated. And again, if you have a 2-hour-long session and you can choose from 4 different pieces of legislation, you're not going to fit all 4 in. So if I, as Senator Ostheimer, say, hey, we're going to debate a bill to end climate change and a bill to recognize Taiwan as an independent nation, that means we may exclude the other 2 bills from discussion, which is often a subject of disagreement for the round, because people will disagree on what we should debate and what we shouldn't debate. Any questions on that? Okay, fantastic. So finally, we get to the good part. After all the nitty-gritty of the procedure, we finally move on to the actual discussion and debate on the legislation at hand. So here you can see a table of how that goes down. The round always starts off with a authorship or sponsorship speech starting off the round in favor of the bill. That is a 3-minute long speech, followed up by 2 minutes of cross-examination. Right after that's done, you have the first negation, which is also a 3-minute long speech with 2 minutes of cross-ex. These 2 speeches are responsible for starting off the affirmative and the negative advocacy regarding the bill. After that, the affirmation and negation speakers just continue to alternate until the debate is over and the chamber decides to move to the previous question and vote on the legislation. How many speakers there are on a bill depends entirely on how many there are in the chamber and how many want to speak. Keep this in mind. No person is obligated to commit to a certain side at the beginning of a round. If you stand up to give the first negation and are passed over by the presiding officer, you might as well also just give the second affirmation, or the third negation, or the fourth affirmation. You are not beholden to any side until you are giving your speech. That also means that the debate isn't necessarily going to be balanced. It happens very often in Congress, even at high levels of competition, that you go into a round and 8 people have an aff prepped and 2 people have a neg prepped. And the judges really do not want to hear 6 affirmation speeches in a row. But if that needs to happen, the presiding officer may call to break cycle and just move on to another speech on the same side. This is highly undesirable. And if you are giving the same side multiple times in a row, the judges have no choice but to tune out, because at some point your side just keeps saying the same thing and you're not adding anything new to the debate. Any questions on that? Okay, fantastic. Finally, let's talk about the judges, one of the most important parts of congressional debates, because they determine how you are ranked and how you are placed. Every judge in a room of congressional debates ranks their top 8 in order of preference. They give the 1 to their favorite debater, the 2 to their second favorite debater, the 3 to their second favorite debater, and so on for the top 8. Meanwhile, everyone that they do not choose to rank defaults to a rank of 9. To determine who gets first, second, and third place in the chamber as a whole, those ranks are added up, and the person with the lowest total gets first place, like in a game of golf. That's simple enough. Any questions? Cool. Okay. And finally, let's break a round of Congress down into each individual chronological part. It can seem intimidating in terms of the procedure and the formalities which you have to go through, but once you get into the swing of it, and once you have it all mapped out, it's really not that hard. So first of all, you arrive at the tournaments and you receive the pairings for the round you have to be in. Then you have to just find your room, you have to enter the round, you might want to discuss who wants to be the presiding officer, what should we have on the dockets before everything finally gets underway. Then when everyone is in their seats, the judges are there, and you have the okay from the tournament to go ahead and get started. It is the chamber's job to nominate and elect the presiding officer. Once that is done, you nominate and elect the docket. And finally, you get to the competition, and you move to debate on the first bill until you're done with that. When there are no more speakers left, you move to the previous question, and then vote on the bill. You just repeat that until you are through with the legislative items on your docket, or until the time in the chamber runs out. Then, when the round is done, someone has to make a motion to adjourn the session, and if there is a second and majority support for that motion, then your round is over. and you just wait for your next round or for the award ceremony. So across this whole overview of congressional procedure and how a round and a Congress tournament works, does anyone have any questions, concerns? Fantastic. Then we can go ahead and start off with one of the first issues when it comes to researching and actually preparing for a Congress tournament, analyzing legislation. Let's start off with a question. Fact or cap? Section 1 of a bill is the only important part to read. What do you guys think?
Cap.
Cap indeed. It is always important to read every part of a bill because there are so many parts of it that can affect the way that you debate the legislation and the arguments you can make around it. Section 1 will almost never include important provisions of the bill, such as the enforcement date. Are we implementing this carbon tax right now or in 2050? The enforcement agency, is the EPA doing it or is the Department of Commerce? What are the punishments for violating a policy? What's the point of having a carbon tax if the punishment for evading it is a $50 fine? And aside from that, any other provision a bill might have, which simply isn't in the first section, will also absolutely affect the legislation which you are debating and, in theory, about to pass. When you're analyzing legislation, here are a few things to take note of when you do your first read through of a bill. Are there any terms you don't know? Often that might be the case. What the heck is a universal basic income? Look it up, make note of it in your document, so that you know what you're actually discussing in the round. Take note of any countries and organizations that are being discussed. Have basic knowledge of the agency which is responsible for enforcing the legislation so that you can discuss the appropriateness and see what power they have to actually enforce that legislation. And two very important things. Think, what problem is this bill trying to solve? And what is the overarching impact of the bill when we pass it? Even at the absolute highest levels of competition, I guarantee you that some of the best and most unique speeches happen as a result of reading the bill more carefully than everyone else and seeing something that no one else saw. So here's an example. Let's talk about a bill to universalize mental health care in the United States. This was in the preliminary docket for 2023 nationals. Section 1 says the United States shall make mental health care services free to all citizens. That sounds fantastic. If we're debating just Section 1, I doubt an awful lot of people will go in the negation. But congressional debate is not about sentiment. It's not about ideas. It's not about should we make something better or worse. It's about how do we make it better or worse. So we move on to Section 2. Mental health care services shall be defined as services from a licensed mental health care provider in psychological assessment and intervention, such as but not limited to therapeutic evaluation, counseling, and medication support. Section 3 reads, the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services within the Department of Human Health and Services will be expanded to oversee the implementation of this bill. A mental health commission will be created to determine covered services. And this legislation will be funded by a 5% income tax increase on those with a household income of $500,000 or more annually. So, what services are covered by this bill, and who determines what they are? Any takers?
The mental health care services in the United States, like the bill title says.
Right. It'll be determined by the Mental Health Commission, detailed in Section 3A. And you wouldn't have known that if you had only read Section 1. Now, someone else, how are we going to pay for these free mental health care services?
Through an income tax, a 5% income tax.
A 5% income tax specifically on who?
On those with a household income of $500,000 a year or more.
That's right. Are the uber wealthy going to be happy about this bill? I don't think so. even if they do need these mental health care services, they're probably paying in more than they're getting out. And of course, when we're talking about a bill that provides a service, if you want to prepare the negation, one of the first places you look is how is this bill going to be funded, and how is it going to affect the people that it takes money from, or the other department that we're redirecting money from. Are there any other observations or questions about this bill that y'all have? Okay, cool. Now, moving on from the bill analysis to background research. You want to make sure you understand all the terms being debated, the actors responsible for implementing the bill, any concepts, and of course, try to make note of all the common arguments on both sides of the round. Even if you don't prep them out entirely, it's good to read through the news, read through the analysis of the legislation itself that you can find on the internet, and think, hey, if I'm a speaker on the affirmation and I'm actually going in the negation, what type of arguments should I anticipate? How can I structure my prep and my speech in order to prepare myself better against those arguments? And once again, it's important to understand all of those related concepts, even if you don't plan on using them, because A, what if you have to speak later in the round than you expect, and you have to refute other people when they make those arguments? Or B, you are one of the 8 affirmation speakers in a bill with only 2 negation speakers, and the chamber expects you to flip to the other side, in which case it's very helpful to have a big picture idea and hopefully some evidence to help you make that transition and change your side. Now, moving on to the brunt of the research, finding evidence and evidence ethics. You want to focus on having impressive and credible citations. I have seen people cite Reddit and Round before. Do not cite Reddit and Round. Cite credible news organizations, cite think tanks, cite peer-reviewed academic sources. Anything along those lines will be adequate for a Congress speech. If you wouldn't cite it in your English essay or your history essay, don't cite it in a Congress speech. And second, one of the most important and unique functions that research can have to do is to quantify the impacts of the bill. Because if we're debating a bill to make healthcare in the United States free and more accessible, I can tell you, hey, pass this bill, we're going to save lives. Very clever. But Senator Ostheimer, how many lives are we going to save? And is the $1 trillion expense going to justify those lives saved? I can't justify that unless I can give you a thorough quantification with evidence of how many lives free healthcare in the US might save. And finally, one important thing to think about when you're doing research: what assumptions are people going to make in this round about the arguments they are making? And can I find evidence that either supports them, and I carve out an important place in the round as someone who lends my side credibility? Or can I find evidence that proves their assumption wrong and say to all the people who are making arguments based on those assumptions, no, my source, credible, peer-reviewed, New York Times, whatever, says that this is not the case, and here's why. Judges appreciate that sort of thing. Here's your little tier list of the credibility of sources. You can be absolutely happy with evidence from government sources, large think tanks like the Brookings Institute or the Marshall Project, prestigious universities, or peer-reviewed studies. All of that is fantastic. Meanwhile, look at evidence cited directly from opinion articles from the New York Times, Washington Post, etc., with a bit more skepticism. They are articulating an opinion just like you are in your Congress speech. Think about citing someone else's Congress speech in your own Congress speech. That's a bit redundant. So unless you're citing actual evidence provided by those authors in support of their opinion article, then treat those sources with more skepticism. And finally, we get to biased news and industry-funded think tanks. If you read evidence from Fox News and you have a liberal judge, are they going to be happy about that? No. If you read evidence from MSNBC and you have a conservative judge, are they going to be happy about that? No. You also don't know if you have a liberal or conservative or anywhere in between judge. Once you dip into this territory, you risk citing sources which your judges just straight up don't believe in or actively distrust. And finally, let's talk about industry-funded think tanks. If I cite the Commission of Petroleum Energy Company executives saying that no, climate change isn't real, here's the evidence to prove it, people aren't really going to believe that. And they shouldn't, because petroleum energy company executives have every reason to think that climate change isn't real and we shouldn't do anything to regulate the environment. So don't cite that. And finally, the bottom tier, of course, like I mentioned, don't cite Reddit. Moving on to the timeliness of citations. As a rule of thumb, how recent your evidence should be kind of ought to depend on the subject you're debating. Let's say you're discussing a bill to pull out American military aid from Saudi Arabia. If you use evidence from 6 years ago, you will find analysis saying, hey, we are sending billions and billions of dollars in military aid and billions of dollars of military sales to Saudi Arabia. And it is responsible for exacerbating the Yemen crisis, in which hundreds of thousands of people have died. But in 2021, President Biden, through executive order, said that we're going to stop doing that because we're not really cool with our money being used to exacerbate a humanitarian crisis. So your evidence from 6 years ago is no longer relevant, while your evidence from 2 months ago is far more relevant. Meanwhile, if you use a topic like abortion, which has been in the public discourse for decades, even centuries, analysis from 6 or more years ago can still be very valid. That being said, as a rule of thumb, to be safe and to sound credible to your judges, don't use evidence that is more than 6 years old. If it's 4 to 5 years old, treat it with caution. 3 months to 3 years old is fine. And if it's less than 2 months old, that's fantastic. Try to emphasize it. I really love having evidence from like the past month or the past week. So I can say yesterday, the Washington Times wrote on September 19th, 2023. And the judges are like, wow, he found evidence from yesterday. It counts for something. So here are some examples. When you are integrating evidence into your speech, do not do it like you are writing an essay, because the content in your speech, including the evidence, has to flow in a way that sounds good when it is said out loud. And the same doesn't hold true for an essay. If you take a part of your English essay and turn it into a 3-minute Congress speech without any other edits, it's going to sound clunky and it's going to sound a little bit odd. Which is why whenever you have a citation and whenever you prepare a source in your speech, I recommend you read it out loud to yourself and think, is this going to sound like it would be natural in human conversation? And if it doesn't, then go back to the drawing board. For example,
Nick, sorry, hate to interrupt you, but I'm not sure if you can see the chat, but someone was asking what about analyses for constitutional amendments?
Oh, like the bills and legislation, like for constitutional amendments?
Yeah. I'm assuming.
Right. So as far as analyzing that legislation, I recommend just being aware of what the Constitution says right now, read through any relevant parts of the Constitution or existing amendments that would be changed by it. For example, this weekend, I'm debating a resolution to amend the Constitution to repeal the 17th Amendment, which is the amendment which made senators get elected by public vote. So to understand that amendment, you have to understand what the 17th Amendment is and think, what did this change from the past when we passed the 17th Amendment? And if we pass this resolution, are we going back to that? Constitutional amendments are a lot less about the immediate practical impacts of passing or failing like it would for a bill or a resolution. You need to think very consciously about the long-term institutional effects of doing so and what it means for the US government and the governance of the United States. It's a lot bigger picture. Okay, back to this example. William Astor, professor of the US Air Force Academy, reports in December of 2022 that without US weapons, Ukraine would have been immediately overrun and lost the war in a matter of months. Meanwhile, if I were to say that without US weapons, Ukraine would have been immediately overrun and lost the war in a matter of months, according to William Astor in a paper published by the US Air Force Academy in December of 2022. By the way, he's a professor. It sounds a lot clunkier when you have the source in the back, because when your audience first hears it, they don't attach the credibility of the title to the claim that you are making. So always keep that in mind. Source comes first. Oh, by the way, never quote directly. Whenever you are quoting from a source, there are two issues with this inherently. It doesn't matter if it's the best source you have ever seen. A, it is not your own thinking, and thus you are not like familiar with it in a way that you are with your own thoughts. And B, it is written. It was not intended to be understood in like spoken language. It was intended to be understood in written word. So whenever you rip anything directly from a source, it is going to sound clunky, and it isn't going to sound like it's in your own voice, which is why you always, always, always paraphrase. We have two more examples. Would anyone like to read the first one?
I can read it.
Sure.
A study by the Brookings Institute in October 2021 found that a carbon tax of only $25 per ton would reduce emissions by up to 38%.
Good. Okay. Would anyone like to volunteer to read the second one?
I can read.
Okay.
Data from the Penn State University and the U.S. Energy Information Administration quantified in June 2022 that new nuclear power plants would be cheaper than 92% of America's current power grid.
Yeah, there you go. And you two, since you read those examples, how do you feel reading that compared to something you say off the top of your head, like you're going to do right now when you respond to me?
It felt very like formal and very scripted, not something I would probably say.
It's a little unfamiliar. It's like kind of like sight reading. Which
Yeah,
it is.
exactly. Which is exactly why, for all of you who are debating any legislation soon for which this evidence might be helpful, which is why I recommend don't take this directly from my slideshow. If you're going to use the same source, find that same piece of evidence, read it, and then write out what you think it says in your own words, because you are going to become familiar with what it means, what it actually says, and you're going to find a way to word it and to phrase it that's comfortable with you. Because Haley and Lyra, as they read this isn't something they wrote. These aren't sources that they probably read, and they had never seen it before. It's unfamiliar to them. Meanwhile, if they had their own evidence that they had researched and had cut for their own speech, they would probably feel much more familiar with it. Any questions about finding evidence and formatting your evidence? Cool. Okay, here are some helpful tools. This whole slide is basically just hyperlinks. You'll be able to access everything here. These are just some notable sources. One I'd like to point out for you here is archive.ph. This is a really cool website that basically allows you to skip the paywall for any paywalled news source. So for example, the New York Times, I don't know if they even have free articles anymore, but sometimes they have interesting articles that are locked behind a paywall, which you can only get through if you pay like an $8, $12 monthly subscription or something. Just take the link, open archive.ph, paste in the link, hit enter, give it 5 seconds, and you'll have the article for free. They pirate it for you. And I highly recommend doing this for any news source or article which will paywall you. Iman asks, does anyone know where we can access this PowerPoint after the Zoom call for future reference? Yes, when we're done, I'm going to drop the link to the slideshow, which is a Google slideshow, in the Zoom chat, and I'll also drop it in the Discord server.
You want me to just do that right now?
Oh, yeah. Oh, and you can do that. Okay, now that we've done all of our research, all of our bill analysis, now that we know how a round of Congress actually works, let's start putting together our arguments. This is the argument structure that I recommend you use. I bet all of you have had many English teachers that have said, here is how you write your essay, here is how you write this essay, use this format, TOC, CWDI, whatever. This is the argument structure that I recommend you use specifically for congressional debate. This stands for status quo, then solvency, then impact. Does anyone know what the status quo means? It's a Latin phrase.
The current state.
That's right. It's the current state of the world. So in the status quo section, the speaker identifies an issue or something that is good with the status quo. Now moving on to solvency. This is where you talk specifically about the legislation and the bill and what it does to change the status quo. If you are an affirmation speaker, you will always argue this makes the status quo better. This solves a problem in the status quo. If you are a negation speaker, you're going to say this gets rid of something good in the status quo. This adds a problem to the status quo. And finally, impact at the end. This is kind of self-explanatory, but it's what your whole argument is working towards. The impact is where you articulate, this is what happens when we pass or fail the bill. This is why it's good or bad. And like I mentioned earlier, this is why you have to quantify, because without a quantified impact, you really don't have much of an impact at all. All right, and I already mentioned all this, so let's skip to the bottom and impact. That question, how does that affect people at a human level? This is another one of the most important things you can do in your impact section. You want to humanize. Let's say I'm speaking on a minimum wage bill, and I say that increasing the minimum wage is going to increase inflation, which is going to make, the inflation rate higher. Okay, maybe the judges have heard of inflation before. Maybe they'll take it at face value and think, yeah, inflation is bad. I heard that on the news. But it is nowhere near as impactful because the impact isn't human. Inflation is a number. It is a percentage point used to describe something that happens in the economy as a whole. What you want to do as a congressional debater is explain how your bill affects people on the ground, how this bill affects your constituents. And that's called humanization. So let's say I'm that same speaker and say, hey, raising the minimum wage causes inflation, which causes the price of goods to go up, which means that people have a harder time buying their groceries and their gas and paying off their student loans, even though they have the same amount of money. See how that is a way more human impact compared to just saying inflation is bad and this causes more inflation? Moving on to the different types of speeches. So before I jump into this thing about constructive speeches, let me preface this by saying congressional debate is not a speech event. It is very much a debate event. As a speaker, it is your job to adapt to the round and add new content to the round. That means that depending when in the debate you are speaking, you have to adjust and adapt your speech to add something new and constructive to the debate. If you are speaking after the first third of a round, you will be expected by your judges to refute other people or to incorporate other people's arguments into your speech, or to somehow change your advocacy depending on what other people have already said. So we're going to cover the 3 different types of speeches, starting with constructives. So these are early round speeches that you usually see in the first third of a debate. This includes the sponsorship, which, like we detailed here, focuses very much on the status quo solvency impact structure. As the very first speaker of a round, it is your job to say, hey, here is the problem that I wrote this bill to address. Here is why my bill works. And here's the impact, why you should care. Aside from that, most constructive speeches include 2 different contentions following generally the same format. It is recommended that you don't repeat prior arguments without adding on something new to them, and that you articulate the common and the most impactful arguments for your side. Now, it is normal and encouraged to add refutation here as well, but it shouldn't be the crux of your speech. It's not expected to be the focus of your speech. Before I move on, do we have any questions about sponsorships and constructives in general? Great. Moving on, let's talk about rebuttal speeches. So these are happening in the second third of the debate, in the middle of the round, unsurprisingly by the name. These speeches focus on refuting the other side. Instead of building up arguments to say, hey, here's why the affirmation or the negation is right, these speeches are responsible for saying, hey, the affirmation or the negation is wrong. You identify the strongest arguments for the side you're going against or against the side that you are on, and you attack those arguments. So let's go back to the status quo structure, status quo solvency impact structure. You can attack the description that a speaker has of every one of these different features. Maybe you say, hey, their description of the status quo is wrong. Let's say they're using that piece of evidence about Saudi Arabia from 6 years ago. You can go up there and say, Representative Ostheimer is completely out of touch with the times. We haven't been sending direct military aid to Saudi Arabia for years. Therefore, his description of the status quo is inaccurate and redundant. Or you can criticize the solvency. Instead of saying that a bill to increase the minimum wage is going to increase inflation, someone on the affirmation of such a bill might say, no, this bill is going to decrease inflation, which means that the impacts can remain untouched because both sides would agree that inflation is bad and causes bad things. They would just disagree on whether or not the bill causes inflation, if you see what I mean. Now, finally, you can also attack on an impact level. This is where, instead of saying that a minimum wage would actually decrease inflation, an affirmative speaker might say, hey, actually, inflation is good. And there is evidence that exists that inflation is good. It's not necessarily great evidence, but it does exist, and you can argue it in a round of Congress. Inflation often is a much more complicated economic phenomenon than people give it credit to be. If you want to make the type of arguments in the affirmation of a bill to increase the minimum wage, you would certainly not be out of place. So does everyone see how you can engage in refutation against all three levels of an argument? I'll take that as a yes. Moving on to the final type of speech, crystallization speeches. These typically happen in the last third of a debate. A lot of people think that crystallization speeches should do different things, but I think I can sum it up in one sentence. In these speeches, you prove why your side wins the round on the big picture. In every other speech, you might just be saying, hey, this bill is good because of this. Hey, this bill is bad because of this. Here you take the picture of the entire round. You talk to your judges and say, today, the affirmation has proven to you for this, this, and this reason that you should pass. Here's why that's all true. And one of the most important parts of a crystallization speech is weighing. Throughout the round, you're going to hear a lot of different impacts. Inflation, lives lost, lives saved, jobs lost, jobs gained. As a crystallization speaker, the burden is on you to weigh these impacts against the other side's impacts and say, this is why everything you've heard from the affirmation or the negation is more important than what you've heard to the other side. Think of it this way. You are using this speech as a chance to convince your judge, having heard what they have heard, which side they ought to vote on. Do we have any questions about crystallization speeches? Okie dokie. Finally, let's move on to the most fun part of Congress, the cross-examination that happens after every speech. So cross-examination has three purposes. One, you want to set up your own speech by questioning someone else. Two, you want to refute the speaker and disprove their arguments while questioning them. Or three, and least importantly, you want to just straight up make clarifications about something confusing that they might have said in their speech. That being said, I think that by far and away, the most useful thing you can do with your own cross-examination time is to set up points in your own speech. For example, you want to expose weaknesses or find concessions that reinforce your own points. Something I often hear is people go up to say, hey, Senator Ostheimer, do you believe that X is true? And if my whole argument is based on the claim that X is true, I'm going to say, yes, absolutely. Then that same speaker is going to follow it up by saying, if I can prove to you that X is not true in my own speech, are you going to fail this bill? The person you're questioning has very little choice to say anything other than, I mean, yeah, that's what my whole speech is based on. I'll switch sides if you can prove that. And if you can prove that in your speech, you get a nice little opportunity to say, hey, Senator Ostheimer, I certainly hope you're going to switch your ballot now. Something like that. Be very careful about what type of cross-examination you are actually going to be using at the circuit you compete in. There is indirect cross-examination and direct cross-examination. In indirect cross-ex, the presiding officer calls up people to ask a single question, hear the answer from the speaker, and then sit back down. There is no back and forth, no follow-up questions. When you see the press secretary of the United States, of the president, take questions from the press corps, think of it as something a little like that. Of course, this dynamic has to affect how you structure your questions. Instead of setting up something clever with a series of questions, you have to focus on clear, simple questions that get across the point in basically a single sentence. This type of cross-ex is, as far as I can tell, the more uncommon type, and is most common in local circuits. For example, I compete in the Palm Beach circuit, and we do use indirect cross-examination for all levels of competition. Meanwhile, direct cross-examination is way more fun and a bit more scary. It consists of 30-second blocks of back and forth questioning. The presiding officer calls someone up, they start a timer of 30 seconds, and I get a chance to ask a question. The speaker answers, and if I have time left, I can ask another question based on their answer, and so on and on until the time runs out. This means that the speaker and the questioner have time to have a much more thorough session because they can follow up on something that the other person said in order to compose a more effective cross-examination. A lot of people let that opportunity go to waste. In direct cross-examination, you should pretty much never use your first question to get to the point directly. You always want to use your first question to get a concession or get an agreement or get a claim, which you can use to frame your next question in a much more strategic light. One issue with direct cross-examination, which is in fact common, is that people speak over each other. They want to make their voice heard. They want to, rush those 30 seconds they have in order to get through the most cross-examination possible. This is not recommendable. If you speak over other people in cross-examination, whether you're the questioner or the answerer, it can make you seem aggressive and impolite, and there are definitely certain bounds of decorum in Congress which you are obligated to observe. Okay, that covers it for cross-examination. Any questions? Awesome, no questions today. One last chance for questions before we start moving on to any activities. Are there any questions about the basic structure, prep, and argumentation writing in congressional debates?
For speeches later on in the round, like refutation speeches and crystallization speeches, I know that you usually use like more extemporaneous speaking. How do you improve in that area?
Okay, yes, that is definitely true. In both rebuttal and crystallization speeches, most of the content which you are delivering usually isn't prepared beforehand. I have a few pieces of advice. First of all, prepare for a refutation or a crystallization speech. Come prepared with evidence on both sides, which is broadly applicable, and you can use that to refute other people and in crystallization speeches either way. Second, there are a lot of drills you can do which exercise your ability to prep very quickly and to speak without being too dependent on your pad, because of course, if you're writing it in round, you can't take efforts to memorize it. So as far as prepping quickly, I recommend quick prep drills where you are shown a new piece of legislation and you get 20 minutes to write a whole speech on it. You can do this with your teammates. I find it to be a great way to test your ability to prep and to practice a speech under pressure. It's kind of like extemp Congress. As far as practicing to speak off the cuff more clearly, my advice, do some extemp on the side. Like, there are so many Congress kids that do extemporaneous speaking as a second event. And the reason is very simple. Extemp competition covers so many of the same topics that we discuss in a round of Congress, and you have to do the entire thing without any reference for 7 minutes, which is difficult, and it definitely makes you a better Congress speaker. Owen has a question: are there different levels of competition in Congress as in other debate topics, like novice, JV, and varsity? The answer is yes, but ultimately it depends totally on the league and where you are competing. On my local league, for example, most of our competitions don't have that novice varsity distinction, while at a competition like Harvard or a lot of state competitions have a varsity and a novice distinction. Haley asks, my team has always told us we could not compete in a debate and speech competition. Is this a NSDA rule? So almost all tournaments will not permit you to double enter in both debate and speech purely for scheduling reasons. But there's nothing stopping you from competing in different events and different competitions. Take that with a grain of salt. There might be certain leagues or certain state organizations that set rules for like committing to a certain event. And of course, your school or just your coach might have some preferences about you sticking to your guns. But at that level, it's not an NSDA rule. And to answer your second question, it's definitely not an NSDA rule at any level. Iman asks, if you're a PO and there's too many speakers either on the AF or the neg and you don't break cycle, what other options are there? The only remaining option you have is to end debate, vote on the bill, and move on to the next one. Or, technically speaking, you can table the legislation, which is basically doing the same thing except not voting, and you retain the option to go back to the bill. But honestly, that pretty much never happens because it's usually rough for the judges and the competitors to split a lively debate in half, just for people to prepare some more speeches. Kristen asks, do you prepare a speech for every bill given by the competition? I don't. I should, and so should you. Congress can take a lot of prep, especially depending on how much time you take to prep legislation and depending how many bills there are at your tournament. A lot of the time, I kind of guess which bills just won't be debated, and I don't spend any or as much time prepping them. So, yeah. Daniel asks, for indirect questioning, what type of questions do you recommend? Is it only worth it to set up your own speech? In other words, what question differences should there be for indirect and direct? For indirect cross-examination, it can be really tempting to ask a really complicated question and fit it all into a single sentence. Don't do that, because whenever I do competitions that use indirect, every speaker ends up having to deal with a question that is completely impossible to understand. Don't, tie yourself into that knot where your super intricate question in one sentence doesn't make any sense. So focus on clear, simple questions that clarify something straightforward that you can use for your own speech, because otherwise, indirect, you get the chance to follow up and say, no, you're wrong, or no, here's why that isn't true, or here's my interpretation of it. While indirect, you don't really get to do that, and your next chance to do that is in your own speech. So yes, I think indirect questioning is definitely focused more on setting up your own speech. Okay. Fantastic. If there are any other questions, just, raise your Zoom hand or drop them in the chat and I'll get to them. But right now we're going to move on to some speech analysis of the NSDA 2023 National Finals Congress round. So first of all, we have Anish Biram, the 2023 national champion, speaking on a bill to send aid to the Northern Triangle. And for those of you who don't know, the Northern Triangle are 3 countries, if I remember correctly. It's El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. So yeah, think about what he does in his speech. If you've already started prepping, is there anything he does differently from you? Is there anything he does the same as you? What is his rhetoric like? What type of arguments does he make? How does he do in cross-examination? Stay tuned.
For the past 2 decades, the Northern Triangle has been trapped. Gangs have strangled their safety. Corruption has crippled their economy. And poverty has practically left them in purgatory. Please, all I ask from you today is to take a stand for those who no longer can. Affirm. Now, first off, I want to chat about funding NGOs and CARSI. I think too much of this debate already has been back and forth. Representative Chen, surprise, not all the NGOs we fund under this bill are corrupt. But here's the thing. Section 3 clearly tells us the State Department audits every organization we fund. So even if Representative Chen and Chickaluri are right, that NGOs, CARSI, and the organizations we fund are corrupt, we can audit them, and the DOS, if they're corrupt, just stops funding them. But secondarily, even if the negative can prove to you that every NGO and every organization we fund is in fact corrupt, we don't actually have to give any money to NGOs at all under Section 1B of this bill. If NGOs are as corrupt as the negative is telling you, go all in on CARSI. Now, so far, my side has focused on things like businesses and gangs, for instance, but they've failed to touch on the most important actor, the justice system. Because nothing else matters if you cannot put a criminal behind bars. Danielle Renwick found for the Council on Foreign Relations that because gangs control the justice system, right now without CARSI, 95% of crimes in the region go unpunished. So even if Representative Alakra and my side are correct that gang power goes down, it does not matter if they cannot be prosecuted. But that's where today's legislation rewrites this narrative. Sonia Nazaro at the New York Times furthers in August of 2016 that in the past, empirically, CARSI has prosecuted 2 times more homicides and 3 times more prosecutions in the past 10 years than prior to its existence. Representative Chen, when the justice system fails 95 out of every 100 victims, you know we have a problem. The answer is staring us in the face. But this is why I also just do not buy Representative Chickaluri's argument that the justice system gets worse under CARSI. I just proved to you empirically it has gotten better. But moreover, you don't just protect their political systems, you protect their lives. Mr. Alakwa tells you that citizens in the Northern Triangle right now depend on gangs. He never told you why that's the case. It is because thousands of citizens have no one else to turn to. Because if your government cannot protect you and cannot defend you, you aren't going to trust your government. Representative Chen is worried about citizens relying on us. But look at their alternative. They are out of hope, out of options, and forced to join an unjust cause just to survive. For the past decade, the Northern Triangle has been trapped. Trapped under the rubble of 2 earthquakes, trapped under the tyranny of gangs and corruption, and trapped by the inaction of this Congress. Take a stand and stand the affirmation. Pass this policy.
Speech time, 2 minutes and 58 seconds. 2 blocks of questioning. Questioners rise. Representative Wilson.
Hi.
Okay, you talk about NGOs, but there still is a possibility that NGOs will receive funding. Like,
Sure.
It's not guaranteed.
I say we fund the good NGOs. We have the power
Okay,
to fund them.
wait. Do Central American countries want NGOs in their country?
NGOs are non-governmental organizations.
That's
They are
not what
independent
that's
of the
not what
government.
I asked. Are these Central American countries asking for these NGOs or asking that we leave them out of it?
I say some don't, some do. But even if they don't, that's symmetric across both sides.
Okay, so if these countries are demanding that we stop sending all these NGOs flooding into
Representative,
them,
my advocacy focuses on CARSI's impact. I
Okay.
say NGOs are
great,
representative.
but you're affirming this legislation.
Ravi.
Hi, good morning.
Hello.
Hi.
So I want to talk about the FDI in this bill for a second.
Sure.
So when people in the Northern Triangle don't have access to good jobs right now, like that's driving income inequality, right?
Sure.
Why does that happen when you increase
I
investment?
say A, there are good NGOs. B, we can get rid of the corrupt NGOs because we audit them.
Right, but it's not about the NGOs. If you don't actually build the governmental reform, what
That's
good
what
does it do?
I'd argue CARSI actually does that as well. CARSI is just a banking system, but it funds a different organization. So it does the justice system, it funds criminal
Question
prosecution.
time has elapsed. Speaker in question may now be seated.
Thank you.
Okay, right off the bat, any first impressions, any observations?
He's very direct.
Okay, can you elaborate on that?
Obviously it's very clear, but it's also that he is directing his speech towards the specific representatives that he is rebutting.
He also seems like a very confident speaker, and he seems like he knows what he's talking about.
Yeah.
I really like how he was able to weave in his refutation throughout his speech, and not just certain blocks of refutation, but throughout the whole speech to make it seem more complete and overall strong as a whole.
Definitely.
Yeah, great warranting to connect his argument to actual impacts that matter.
Yeah.
In response to the point about NGOs, he did well to make it clear that he was not really talking about it.
That's true. One thing one of you touched on is how he weaved in that refutation throughout the speech, so it didn't just come in blocks. That's definitely true. His refutation was very deliberate. So one principle of refutation, Anish did a very good job of demonstrating here, is don't refute individual speakers, refute arguments. So throughout this round, the negative side have been talking about NGOs and why they're bad and why we need to do something about them. So his advocacy wasn't focused really against a single individual person and the points they made, but against the point about NGOs. And of course, he name-dropped everyone who contributed to that point as necessary. Okay, so consider some of these prompts. What role does referencing other people play in persuading the audience to vote for his side?
It kind of frames the round to show that he actually knows what the other people are saying.
Yes. A big part of it is perceptual, demonstrating to your judges that you're keeping track of what everyone is saying and you can respond to it, at the turn of a dime is definitely a very big perceptual part of, persuading the judges. How does humanizing the impacts of the bill change the judge's outlook on the bill in his speech?
It goes from abstract to real.
Yeah. I mean, in the end, whether it's you competing at a local or a niche in the final round of 2023 nationals, you're all just dressed up high schoolers pretending to talk about legislation in a room. It is so important to make sure that your advocacy focuses on individual people and how the policy would address them. Keep that in perspective as you write your arguments and as you watch everyone else give their speeches. Anyone else want to add any other notes or comments before we move on? Okay, now let's watch Raghav Ramki speak on a bill that would mandate all police to receive a 4-year degree, as well as some other standards.
Think for a second about this perfect police officer the affirmation keeps advocating for. Rule follower, they take orders well and they arrest every lawbreaker they see. Who are we trying to train here? RoboCop? I mean, police aren't robots. They don't just magically get better at not shooting minorities. You don't have to send them to Harvard to teach them not to hate poor people. It's a wild idea, but police are people. They belong to communities. The winner of today's debate bridges the gap between our people and our police force. The affirmation, tears that bridge apart. I want to split this bill in half. First, we'll talk about departments, then individuals. Let's start with the departments. Representative Biram, Cheng, Ilakwa, and Chordia all jump on this idea that training is so good. But what does it look like? Dr. William Lewinsky of Obama's Police Task Force explains that current academy training takes 21 weeks and costs a department $100,000. When you pass today's legislation, that cost is over $500,000 per officer. Why is indebted departments bad? The Brennan Center for Justice explains that when departments are indebted, they don't take that line down. They increase arrest quotas by giving out more arrests, tickets, and arresting more people. It increases the funds in their department. It doesn't matter how much education you give, Representative Chordia, if your department will direct you to act in opposition to that. But secondly, I want to look at police, literally. Representative Chundru touched on this, but let's see how bad it really is. ABC News explains in May of 2021 that 99 of our 100 biggest cities have a police force that's whiter than the community. 538 takes it a step further. Most cops don't even live in the cities they work in. The fact of the matter is, cops aren't welcome in these communities. They're strangers, anxious, and afraid. When you add these college requirements in today's legislation, you price out the few low-income, minority, and female cops we have. Then you have rich white guys running everything, just like this Congress. You can't expect it to work well because it's just not a good thing. Representative Wilson wanted a statistic. I'll give it to you. The journal Science explains that Black, Hispanic, and female officers made fewer stops and arrests, and it wasn't even close. White officers arrested Black civilians 40% more often than Black officers did. Surprise, when there's more stops, there's more opportunities for violence. Take these together. You have an alienated police force that's looking for a problem. Last year, 1,200 homicides were committed by those who swore to protect and serve. But what does that statistic feels like? It's when you see a police car roll up and there's that ounce of hope in you that when they roll down that window, it's a face that looks like ours. Think about the leaders that have changed this world. King, Mandela, Parks. But the faces that make the difference are the officers who ask the kid why they're stealing the meal, ask the student why they're walking home alone. The faces that change your world are the ones you see each and every day.
Thank you, Representative, for that speech of 3 minutes and 10 seconds. All cross-examiners, please rise. That'll first go to Representative Biram.
Hi.
I preempted this funding argument. I told you 87% of funding comes from local and state governments. Why would they not just increase funding to counter the debt that's incurred?
Because departments have their own way to make this back. We've seen this in the status quo. When
How?
departments
You gave us zero empirical evidence.
This is just obvious past history, right? The majority of your funding comes from ticket and bill.
If the comparative is either you go into a police shortage or have abusive and aggressive policing,
I'm not worried about a shortage. I'm telling you, the department will direct people to arrest more.
So why
That's
would you
how
not
they make the
increase
money
community funding for police?
Representative
Representative, couldn't increased training and stricter enforcements increase public trust in police?
No.
Why? They're
At the end of the
stopping.
day, the public doesn't trust police because of the actions they take.
Yes, but
Seeing
it gets
today's
rid of
legislation
people.
doesn't change that.
Yes,
I
but it gets rid of people who convicted crimes, ads in education. Isn't that extensive
But if the
requirement?
police force is still committing abuses, I'm not going to
But won't
trust
they
them.
decrease that as we prove the college
I spent
evidence?
my entire 3 minutes talking about how today's legislation doesn't fix anything.
It's
You
not supposed to
perpetuate the
fix
problem.
everything.
It doesn't fix anything. There's no benefits.
Okay, and then for minorities, why won't the tuition reimbursement?
Okay. So, any observations, any first impressions?
He really hit the human part of it a few different times with anecdotes and things. And he also added very large emphasis on the impacts.
That's true. This speech stands out for its focus on rhetoric, definitely. Okay.
He's funny.
He is. Being funny in Congress is hard. Raghav did it well. All right. Moving on to the prompts. What impact does his humor have on his speech? How do you think it affected his ranks? What do you think the judges thought? Haley. I can see
he was
unmuted, but I can't hear you.
he was a funny speaker, but I felt as if there wasn't enough evidence to back up what he was saying, and that lowered his credibility.
Okay. What in particular, like, did you observe not enough evidence for?
He specifically stated at one point, "This is just common knowledge," or "This is just seen a lot." And he used that rather than actually having facts to back it up, while the other person, I believe, did have a fact.
That's true. Anish got up and questioned him about the argument of where do departments get their funding from. Raghav's argument was based on, this phenomenon where police departments pay out tickets, they make extra arrests, they meet quotas, and that eventually gets them more money in fines and whatever from the community. And he argued that would help them pay off, the added cost of hiring these more expensive police officers. That's an intuitive argument. It definitely isn't backed up by pre-existing precedent. While Anish got up there and said, hey, these departments get 87% of their funding from local and state agencies. So what does your argument have to do with that when they get most of their money from entirely separate means? So Anish's statistic measuring up against Raghav's logic, the judges almost definitely will have differing opinions as to who they believe more, but I agree that Anish very likely got out on top of that questioning block.
Also, on a kind of unrelated note, while they were speaking, they were kind of talking over each other for a bit, which made it kind of hard to understand what they were saying for a brief moment.
Yeah. And that is a difficult line to tread, because the impulse to speak over the other person is always there, since you want to get your word in and you want to speak more and you want to make the most of your time. But when they speak over each other, like Grayson points out, at some point they just become inaudible, and the judges don't get anything from it. Okay. Any last comments before we move on to one final activity?
I really liked how passionately he spoke. I definitely think that even during questioning, that set him apart from his competitors, because you could clearly tell that he was very passionate and educated on the issue.
I agree. Okay. Finally, today, as our last activity, we're going to hear from two other equality and forensics coaches. To put things into perspective, they're going to give you a speech from when they were first starting out in congressional debate compared to a speech from now. So first, they're going to tell you a little about the bills they're going to debate. They're going to give their speech, and then we're going to have 1 minute of direct cross-examination for each. So after each of their speeches, I will call for a cross-ex, and I encourage one of the audience members to stand up and question them. So first, I'd like to introduce Sarah Youssef, one of our longtime coaches, to introduce herself and do the thing.
All right. Hi, everyone. My name's Sarah. I've been in Congress for 4 years. This is my 4th year. I've been in debate for 7 now. And Nick, do you want to share my speech on the screen, or how do we want to do this?
Can you send the documents in the chat?
Yeah. Just a note to everyone, I am still recovering from a collapsed lung. So my breath might be just a little I might seem a little out of breath. Here's the first speech. This was one of the very, very first speeches I wrote. 1 second. Okay, sorry, my mom just came in. So it's on Egyptian microloans, and it was supposed to give like women in Egypt microloans for their businesses. I went neg. I don't think this is like the worst argumentation I've written. It wasn't great, but like you'll see, even like if you're starting, like you can grow from this level, is what I mean. So I'm gonna give the speech and then we'll do cross and then I'll get the new one, which is much better. All right. Amira took out a microloan of $423 to buy buttons and yarns to make purses to sell sweaters to her neighbors in Egypt. She was desperate. She's a mother of 7, and now she fears being imprisoned for only being $613 in debt. This is a common situation that women in the Middle East have to face every day, because today's legislation would only worsen the state of empowering women in Egypt. I strongly urge you to fail this legislation. Now, Representative Katz, I completely agree that we need to empower women, but because women make less money, they usually actually can't pay back these loans, which is why I strongly urge you to fail today's legislation, because microloans hurt women more. If we pass today's legislation, it actually only leads to more women being harmed through debt. Because Egypt's system disproportionately affects women, because of the lower pay women make, most of the time they can't pay back their debt of the microloans. Representative Benapati and Lovett, I agree with the fact that most times Egyptian women don't get the money through these loans, but you're ignoring the situation in which they do. Because the New York Times found that over 7,000 women in Jordan were not able to repay their microloans, leading to them ending up in debt. And women in Egypt make 35% less than males. This was found to be fairly common around Middle Eastern countries, where women's salaries cannot make up the amount that they need to pay back the microloan. This shows that this is not the right way to empower women. This is especially true in Egypt, where they're not able to repay a loan can be detrimental to women, because the caravan explains in many cases how women are imprisoned over small debts in Egypt, and debtors can only be released from prison if they come to a compromise with their creditors over the debt in which they're paying, which is highly improbable, making these women take out loans and spend over 3 years in jail. Representative, you explain how we need to help women in poverty, but we aren't helping them under today's legislation. We're only hurting them more by putting them in debt. We are not empowering women, we're hurting them. I'm sure everyone here wants to help the women, but this is not helping them. It's the opposite intent of this bill. And while helping these women financially through microloans may seem like a good thing, it will only drive them into terrible debt or end with them being jailed. The impact is clear. Failing today's legislation, we keep women in Egypt from drowning in debt or facing jail time. The negation is saying we shouldn't empower women, but we are saying that we need a viable solution to actually help them. Fail this legislation. Okay, Nick, I was not aware you were timing me.
Thank you, Representative Youssef, for that speech of 2 minutes and 42 seconds. All questioners, please rise.
Guys, that was not a speech to be scared of. I wrote that my freshman year.
Representative Lyra.
Okay, isn't it possible, Representative Youssef, that the Egyptian government could be falsely imprisoning these women?
So yeah, that's my point, that they are. So when we give them loans, the issue is that we're not changing the culture of Egypt's government, which will lead to more of them in debt.
Couldn't we do both?
We could, but this legislation specifically does nothing to like legislate that Egypt's government has to do anything, and I'm very not inclined to think that they will.
Thank you. Representative Gagnato.
I get your point about debt, but can't we just only give loans that we know these women will actually have the capabilities to pay back?
Yeah, so the issue is if we go by that logic, almost no woman in Egypt will be getting these loans, or at least the ones that need them, right? Because if they're actually financially able to pay back these loans, most of the time they don't need them to start up their business.
Okay, cool. So that's the end of cross-ex for this first speech. Saad, I saw you have a question, but you'll have another 6 chances. So Sarah, do you want to go on to your more recent speech?
Yeah, this one's on green jobs. I gave this one at a camp tournament. It was a Harvard topic as well. And I think you'll see a lot more of my personality in this in general. So I don't know the timing of this because it doesn't have ref. My ref is on a pad. So, all right. Every single morning, people wake up to the light of a new day. And even though we all see the same sky, some awaken from penthouses, while others rise from parking lots. Today's bill bridges the gap between those who make millions and those who make none. Pass this legislation. Now, honestly, in this round, I've been hearing the same old, same old. So let's run this back. Senator Same Old 1 says that it'll cost too much. Senator Same Old 2 says we can't change our ways. And Senator Same Old 3 says it simply won't work. But aren't you sick of the same old, same old? Because the University of Chicago Press explained in 2016 that cutting all oil subsidies would actually only increase gas prices for Americans by $2 for the full year because of where our green technology is at with development. But this bill invests at least 20% into nuclear energy, while cutting oil subsidies and forcing companies to switch their business models from oil to green tech. But why haven't they made the switch already? It's because ZME Science explained in April of 2023 that oil won't run out for the next 53 years. It's clear why companies are reluctant to make the switch. They have over half a century left of exploitation. This bill now invests with a focus on nuclear energy, finally diverting our investment from oil to nuclear. But here's why it's such a good option. Other representatives have told you that nuclear energy is hazardous and dangerous. I'd argue with our development that it's not, because the International Atomic Agency, since March of 2023, that thorium reactors, which are nuclear reactors that don't run on uranium, can be made in 3 years and already could power America. They just need more investment to allow us to fully transition. But why does that matter? It's because our constituents save more. Because American Progress explained in October of 2021 that investing in nuclear energy decreases power bills per household by $500. That may not seem like a lot to all of us, but for some, that's rent. For others, a month of groceries. And for all of us, that could be a pretty great start to a summer vacation. Affirming ensures companies make the right choice by supporting our nuclear power infrastructure. We give every citizen the chance that they deserve to go from that parking lot to that proverbial penthouse. Pass.
Thank you for that speech of 2 minutes and 44 seconds. All questioners, please rise. Representative Sashwani.
Okay, Representative, great speech. My only problem with it is you yourself say we see an increase of $2 in gas prices, right?
So that's actually for the full year. It's not like every time I go fill up the tank, I'm going to see a $2 increase. It's
Okay, but even a
year.
$2 like overall increase would still be doubling of gas prices. How does that not hurt
No,
low-income
it's not, because
Americans?
if I'm spending this chunk amount on gas per year, you just add $2 to that total, but I'm saving $500 on energy cost as well.
Thank you. Representative Briggs.
Where would the money to fund this nuclear energy come from?
Well, it comes from the US government as well as companies switching from oil to green tech, because we've shown that it's going to be more profitable in the future by cutting their subsidies.
And the US government, would they have to raise taxes in order to give the companies this money?
Okay, I don't have the exact bill in front of me. I think it created new green jobs, so that way it would invest in like Americans creating those jobs.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Questioning time has elapsed. Speaker may be seated. Thank you, Representative Youssef.
Do you want me to explain like what went into this speech a little bit?
Yeah, sure. Do you want to screen share, by the way, if you want to like point anything out?
Yeah. Okay, let me do that now. Continue. Okay, perfect. Okay, so this speech is interesting because I like came to a point in my debate career where I felt like I was like getting, argumentation on its basics, and I was like getting all these things, but like I kind of wanted to step it up kind of like towards Rogov, but I'm not a funny conventional person. So I chose to do like a little bit of sarcasm towards the beginning, with this like same old, same old. I didn't even like call people by their name. I just used this instead. So that was like my way of incorporating my personality. And then I took the basics of like the argumentation structure and I made it a little bit more advanced. So I knew that the whole round would center around this idea of, are we going to be raising gas prices for Americans? This will come as like you debate more, you're able to predict where debates are going to go, especially with common topics such as like carbon tax or environmental bills. They all kind of go the same way. So I found this really great card that said like in total it would like only raise it $2 per year. So I was like, all right, I'm going to put this first, take out all the negation on that, and then go into my point. So then I took a main part of the bill, and I kind of explored like why right now are companies not making the switch. That was my SQO. And it was because like oil won't run out. Then I talked about how switching to nuclear is good. And I kind of took out this idea too that like nuclear is unsafe, since I kind of knew some people would be bringing that up as well. I found like thorium reactors are safer. So that way I knew I could integrate ref as I was going later on in the round. And then I had this impact of that our constituents save more. And I made my rhetoric so that way it shows what that looks like to an average person, or even to someone who's not struggling, what that $500 can look like. And I kind of had this whole theme of like going from the parking lot to the penthouse and how every American deserves that. Yeah.
Okay, great. Before we move on to Owen, do we have any questions for Sarah?
Yeah, go ahead.
Did you write this session or the speech, in session on your computer, or did you like kind of have your cards on your computer and then like on your legal pad or something, you'd write them down and give it as a speech?
Yeah, so I don't think I have a pad near me, but the way I pad, you're gonna have to find a system that works for you, is I take different color coding, like one for my evidence, one for my rhetoric, one for my intro and stuff, and I like write them out with a decent amount of space. So what you saw on there is exactly what went on my pad. And I just made sure it obviously wasn't word for word towards what I was saying, but I like would extemp some of that, I would keep some of that. And just so that way I knew that I was hitting the rhetoric lines that I really wanted to include. But that would all go in my pad, and then I just write ref in red. And because I was able to predict it so easily, for like the refutation, I didn't have to do a lot of work of writing up new refutation. It just kind of was like insert the names and then go forward with it.
Oh, so like would you write the whole speech out and then on your legal pad you would just write down certain bullets that you needed to use depending on how the round went?
No, so what was on the Google Doc actually went like on my legal pad. Like I would just write out what's on the Google Doc on my legal pad, and I would go up with that. The only thing I would change in round is I would cut anything if I needed to for time's sake, or I would integrate names for reputation. I hope that makes sense.
Thank
you. Okay, sweet. Owen, if you want to introduce yourself and take it away.
Sure. Hey, I'm Owen. So for this, I put the link to my speeches in the chat. For this, it's a bit different. It's the like same two speeches basically, but like revised over time. The first speech I did was like, I think my second ever tournament as a novice. And then the second one was later in the year, and that revised. There's a bill there. So I think how this is probably going to work, I'll like read my first speech and then we'll go over like things that stick out to you as like kind of flaws in it, or like things that need to be worked on. And then I'll give the second revised one. And then we can do like 2 minutes of cross X after that, just to make up for the one lost for the first one, because it's on the same topic. Yeah. And this is also, by the way, the same bill that like Anish was speaking on, the first one we watched in House Finals. So like you might be a bit familiar with it from there. But yeah, I'll just start my first word unless there are any objections. So the first one's like as a novice. Great. Just setting stuff up. 1 second. Okay. Great. And just keep in mind like what like you think like needs to be worked on in this thing. The saying goes that the grass is always greener on the other side of the fence. But the truth is that the US has the resources to make our economy strong, violence minimal, and grass far greener. And instead of making the other side greener to stop people from hopping the fence, this Congress has chosen to make that fence higher and wrap it with barbed wire. It's time to end the insolvent hostility at our border and make Latin America's grass greener, economy strong, and violence minimal. Affirm. Firstly, let's begin by contextualizing the two key issues. Firstly, poverty, and secondly, violence. Firstly, poverty. Georgetown reported last month that 13.8% of people in Latin America live in extreme poverty, with over 200 million people beneath the poverty line, setting Latin America's progress back by 27 years, according to the UN. Secondly, violence. According to the World Bank, every 15 minutes, at least 4 people in the region become victims of homicide, meaning that from now to when my questioning period elapses, one more person's life will have been robbed from them. The issues are clear. Secondly, how does my bill solve them and curb the overflow in immigration shelters? Well, according to the Washington Post, migrants are coming to the southern border for 2 key reasons: poverty and violence. So firstly, affirm to curb poverty. The European Council on Foreign Aid furthers that increasing developmental aid to Latin America significantly decreases poverty. According to the Congressional Research Center, under US aid, poverty rates in Latin America have gone from 45% down to 30% since 1990. Additionally, under Section 1B, the other half of this aid goes to CARSI, which USA tells us has directly resulted in an annual 3% increase in economic growth. But secondly, affirm to curb violence. Under Section 1B, CARSI distributes funding to businesses, and the University of Delaware found that every 1% increase in business growth in Latin America via foreign aid reduced gang violence by 1.3%. In fact, USAID continues that when we gave just $7.6 million to 47 companies in the region, we created 27,000 new jobs. As a result, Vanderbilt reports that CARSI specifically resulted in 51% fewer residents hearing of murders and violence. But not only has USAID worked before, it actually works better under today's legislation. This is because the aid audits under Section 3 ensure that this aid is used effectively. Because according to the University of Berkeley, aid audits reduce corruption by 8% and increase legal responsibility by 20%. End this neglect for Latin American countries. Pass today's legislation. Great. So I guess anything that comes to mind is like flaws in that. Also, I forgot to mention, but I have COVID right now, so my voice is like kind of scarce if like my voice is cracking at random spots. But just like any like issues with it overall, like it might be a bit convoluted, whatnot. Feel free to like interject.
You want to do cross first?
Oh, as I was saying, we do that like at the end, just like double it down because it's the same like speech.
Sure.
Okay. If like I'm happy to get the issues started with this, but I think for this it's like way too rushed. I honestly think like reason, and also by the way, because I'm on another doc, so if you have like an issue, whatever, please feel free to just like interrupt me. But it's like way too rushed and trying to accomplish way too much in like in the span of this one speech. In 3 minutes, I'm trying to cover poverty, violence, the border crisis, corruption, and many systemic issues which people literally dedicate their entire lives to doing. I'm not going to solve this in 3 minutes. By like trying to accomplish way too much, you compromise your entire speech because to be honest, the judges just like stop caring and stop following you. Additionally, it's not really compelling. Honestly, at parts you probably felt like I was just dumping cards on you and pieces of evidence. And there wasn't like compelling rhetoric, whatnot. Like as we saw in Rogov's speech, when you saw like how he's like humanizing what he actually showed, that could like make up for a lack of evidence sometimes. And additionally, I sometimes like framed the arguments into things they actually weren't. The introduction was about like the border crisis, but then the introduction was like about the border crisis, then my speech was about helping Latin America. It was just a bit confusing. It was just like not conversational. It was pretty robotic. Try to be like as conversational as possible. Yeah. Are there any other things that holes people see in this? Like, please feel free to say anything. I'll give you all a moment. It can be anything at all. Like, it doesn't have to be anything substantive.
I had a question just like about your stat about like the decrease of 45 to 30%.
Mm-hmm.
So wouldn't couldn't that be attributed to like an increase in like infrastructure just as the world gets more progressive?
Yeah, well, I'd honestly argue that like a lot of that progression is as a result of past US aid, because we're like the leading aid contributor in Latin America. So a lot of that progression is as the result of US aid. But I think like I definitely agree with what you're saying. Like I think that like it's important to like see like what the actual difference is. And I think that like in cross-ex, that'd be a really good point to bring up.
I feel as if it's very strong evidence-based, but it's just not emotionally. I just don't feel anything from the speech. It just feels like speaking at me.
No, yeah, totally. Like, I think some things that like a lot of people forget, this might seem like the most obvious thing out there, but we're talking about like human beings here. Like, just like some statistic about like X amount of people die, like those are people. That's like somebody's mother, somebody's parents. That like try to make the audience feel that and try to serve them justice as if they're like sitting there right in front of you. Like, I couldn't agree with that more. I think like the thing that separates like a good speaker and like a truly like a moving speaker is like how they actually like and evidence can be what sorry, evidence can be whatever, but it's like what you make of it that matters. So yeah, I totally agree with that. Anyone else? Okay, with that, I guess I'll just move into the more revised version, and then after we'll do like cross-ex for that in like 2 minutes. So like for people, so feel free to like be typing up questions during the speech so you can be ready for that. So I'll just begin on my first word for that. Sorry, I have COVID. Okay, great. It's easy to stand as privileged in these halls of Washington to advocate for our constituents, but it's hard to truly put yourself in the shoes of those who need us the most, because today, the people of Latin America call for help, and when this legislation finally answers them, you affirm. Now, let's begin today's debate by contextualizing the status quo. More specifically, the poverty and violence which runs rampant throughout Latin America. Firstly, to look at poverty. Georgetown reports that 13.8% of people in Latin America live in extreme poverty, and after the pandemic, over 200 million people live beneath the poverty line, setting Latin America's progress back by 27 years, according to the UN. To quantify the impact of this, according to the Pan American Health Organization, over 41% of people in Latin America are facing acute hunger and starvation. They are literally starving for change. But secondly, onto violence. According to the UN, Latin America is home to fewer than 9% of the world's population. It accounts for 33.5% of the world's homicides. In fact, according to the World Bank, from now to when my questioning period elapses, one more person's life will have been robbed from them. And to vote in negation leaves their blood on this Congress's hands. Now, how does my bill solve the poverty and violence in the status quo? Firstly, to address poverty. Under Section 1A, half of this aid goes to CARSI, which USA tells us has directly resulted in an annual 3% increase in economic growth. The European Council on Foreign Aid furthers that increasing developmental aid significantly decreases poverty. In fact, the Congressional Research Center quantifies that under US aid, poverty rates in Latin America have reduced from 45% down to just 30% since 1990. But hand in hand with poverty comes, secondly, violence, because the Latin American Economic Review attributes recent upticks in crime to miserably low employment. Under Section 1B, the other half of this aid is given to funding businesses, consequently increasing employment rates and decreasing crime. To put into perspective just how effective this is, USAID explains that when we gave just $7.6 million to 47 companies in the region, we created 27,000 new jobs. This matters because the University of Delaware found that every 1% increase in business growth in Latin America via foreign aid reduced gang violence by 1.3%. While that may seem like a simplistic statistic and nameless number, to those in Latin America, this isn't just a matter of af or neg. It's a matter of life or death. Senators, as we stand here in our tailored suits and polished shoes, remember those who fear for their lives in the continent south of us. Affirm. Great. Okay, that's that.
Thank you for that speech. We're going to do 4 blocks of cross-ex. So all questioners, please rise. Representative Gagnato.
Hi, Senator. So you mentioned how like an increase in businesses will present a decrease in crime, right?
Yes. Well, an increase in employment.
Okay, but how is that actually going to happen if to employ these people, they have to be well educated, well like qualified? How is that going to happen if they're usually in crime?
I'd argue that that's not always the case for laborers, for example, or in Latin America where not everyone's getting a college education. While I think there are some of those like higher jobs, I don't think every single job that we're creating under this is necessarily one of those jobs you need like a college degree for.
I agree, but what about jobs that usually the jobs that you have more education for, don't they provide more resources and more economic benefits for them? Wouldn't we want them to go to those jobs?
Representative Sachawani.
Thank you. So basically, you're saying that you dramatically decrease poverty, right?
Yes. As I cited, like,
okay.
Go ahead.
What happens when we like pull out of there? What happens to poverty when we pull out all aid?
I mean, under this bill, you're giving them like you're not pulling it out. Essentially, what you're doing is you're giving them.
Yeah, but like in the future, for example, what if we pull out that aid? Does that not like destroy their economy?
Well, that applies for annually renewed aid. Under this, you're giving them a fixed amount that we're not able to pull out.
Representative Hurtado.
In your speech, you specifically state that Latin America is calling for help, but according to the Pew Research Center, the majority of Latin America does not view the U.S. in a favorable light. Are we sure that Latin America wants this aid?
Okay, I'm telling you that the people that are dying want their life. I think that's what matters in this round, not what the governments think of the U.S. intervention.
Representative Lyra.
Okay, so you say that, well, the bill says that there's, we would invest $50 million in this bill. So wouldn't this bill cause inflation for these countries, and wouldn't it make it much more difficult for especially these perhaps corrupt governments to be allocating these resources?
The thing is, they're not allocating the resources. When 41% of people are going starving, I don't think that inflation is somehow the brink or like the pushing point. I think they're already past that point.
Thank you. Questioning time has elapsed. Speaker may be seated.
Great, thank you.
All right. Well, if anyone has any last questions for Owen, shoot. All right. Well, in that case, that's kind of it. Thank you guys for coming. I'm going to end the recording real quick.